The Silence of St. Mary Mead, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with something unusual for a village like St. Mary Mead: silence. No gossip drifting across garden fences, no murmured conversations in the tea shop, no curious glances from behind lace curtains. It is as though the entire village has quietly agreed not to speak about something. Miss Marple notices the stillness immediately. In a place where everyone knows everyone's business, silence is never natural. It means someone is hiding the truth, and others are far too afraid, or far too involved, to say a word. As she begins to gently ask her questions, it becomes clear that this silence is not peace. It is protection. Because in St. Mary Mead, when everyone stops talking, it usually means the truth is far too dangerous to say aloud. Before we uncover what the village is trying so hard to keep quiet, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Silence Begins. The village of St. Mary Mead had always been known for its gentle quiet. It was the sort of place where mornings began slowly, with pale sunlight falling across the narrow lanes and the distant ringing of the church bell drifting across the fields. People greeted one another politely outside the small shops, and news traveled from garden gate to garden gate with a calm certainty. Nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen in St. Mary Mead. That was what everyone believed. Yet villages, like people, sometimes hide truths beneath their calm appearance, and when those truths finally begin to surface, the silence that once felt comforting can suddenly become deeply unsettling. Miss Jane Marple noticed the change before anyone else spoke of it openly. She had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to understand its rhythms better than most people understood their own daily habits. That morning she was sitting beside the window of her cottage, knitting carefully while looking out toward the road that passed her garden gate. She always liked to watch the village wake up. It was a small habit that told her a great deal about the lives of her neighbors. Usually by this hour the baker's delivery cart had already rolled past, and the vicar would soon be seen riding his bicycle toward the church. But on that particular morning the road remained strangely empty, and even the birds seemed quieter than usual. Miss Marple placed her knitting carefully in her lap and adjusted her spectacles as she studied the silent road. The absence of people did not trouble her in itself. Villages often had quiet mornings. What disturbed her was the feeling that something had interrupted the normal pattern of life, something that made people hesitate before stepping outside their homes. It was the kind of silence that suggested uneasiness rather than peace. A moment later the small gate of her garden opened with a faint creak, and Mrs. Hartley from the neighboring cottage stepped inside. Mrs. Hartley was normally a cheerful woman who enjoyed conversation more than most people enjoyed their morning tea. Yet today she walked slowly toward the garden table with a worried expression that did not suit her at all. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said in a slightly strained voice. Miss Marple greeted her warmly and invited her to sit beside the small table where the autumn sunlight touched the edge of the garden path. Mrs. Hartley lowered herself into the chair, but instead of speaking immediately she glanced toward the road again, as if she feared someone might overhear what she was about to say. "You have heard the news, I suppose," Mrs. Hartley said at last. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No, I am afraid I have not heard anything this morning." Mrs. Hartley leaned forward and lowered her voice in the careful tone people often used when speaking about unpleasant matters. "It is about Mr. Edward Blake." Miss Marple recognized the name at once. Edward Blake had moved into the village only a few months earlier. He had taken a modest house not far from the churchyard and lived there alone. The villagers had tried to welcome him politely, but he remained distant and private. He attended church sometimes but rarely joined conversations afterward. No one knew very much about his past, and that alone was enough to make people uneasy in a place like St. Mary Mead. "What has happened to Mr. Blake?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Hartley took a deep breath before answering. "He has been found dead." Miss Marple's hands remained folded calmly in her lap, though her mind immediately began examining the possibilities. Death itself was not unusual. Even in peaceful villages people grew ill or suffered accidents. But the way Mrs. Hartley spoke suggested something far less ordinary. "Where was he found?" Miss Marple asked. "In the church," Mrs. Hartley replied. "Inside St. Mary Mead Church itself. The caretaker opened the doors this morning and discovered him lying near the front pew." Miss Marple's thoughtful expression deepened slightly. "That is certainly unusual." Mrs. Hartley nodded quickly, relieved that someone understood her concern. "Yes, exactly. People do not simply collapse in the church without a reason. And that is why everyone is whispering about it." Miss Marple considered the matter carefully. "Has the doctor examined him?" "Yes, Dr. Hayward was called immediately," Mrs. Hartley said. But his answer only made things more confusing. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "How so?" Mrs. Hartley lowered her voice even further. "The doctor says there is no clear cause of death." Miss Marple remained silent for a moment as she absorbed this information. A death without an obvious cause was rarely simple, especially when it occurred in such an unusual place. Mrs. Hartley continued speaking, clearly unsettled by the entire situation. "The caretaker said Mr. Blake looked as though he had simply fallen to the floor, but the doctor believes something frightened him just before he died. Apparently his expression suggested shock or fear." Miss Marple's eyes moved slowly toward the distant church tower that rose above the trees at the end of the village lane. It stood peacefully against the pale sky, exactly as it always had, yet the story Mrs. Hartley had just told gave the building an entirely different feeling. "Did anyone see him enter the church last night?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Hartley shook her head. "No one seems to know when he went inside. The church was locked late yesterday evening, and the caretaker insists that everything was normal when he closed the doors." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. If the caretaker had locked the building properly, then Mr. Blake must have entered before the church was closed. That meant he had chosen to be there intentionally. "Did Mr. Blake have enemies?" Miss Marple asked after a moment. Mrs. Hartley looked uncertain. "No one knows much about him. He arrived quietly and kept to himself. But there were rumors, of course." "There are always rumors," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Hartley nodded. "Some people said he had been involved in financial trouble in another town. Others believed he was hiding from someone. But no one had proof of anything." Miss Marple picked up her knitting again, though she did not begin working on it yet. Her mind was already forming careful questions. "Tell me," she said calmly, "what is the village saying about the matter now?" Mrs. Hartley hesitated before answering. "That is the strange part. Most people are saying nothing at all." Miss Marple looked up sharply. "Nothing?" Mrs. Hartley shook her head slowly. "It is as if everyone has agreed to remain silent. People speak about the weather, about the harvest, about anything except Mr. Blake." Miss Marple leaned back in her chair and gazed thoughtfully toward the quiet village road. Silence could sometimes mean respect or discomfort. But it could also mean fear. And fear in a small village rarely appeared without a reason. As the church bell began to ring in the distance, Miss Marple felt a quiet certainty forming in her mind. Mr. Edward Blake's death inside St. Mary Mead Church was not a simple accident, and the strange silence spreading across the village suggested that someone already knew more than they were willing to say. The mystery had begun, not with noise or violence, but with something far more troubling. An entire village that had suddenly chosen to remain silent. Chapter 2: The Silence Hides the Truth. The news of Edward Blake's death travelled quietly through St. Mary Mead during the day, but it never became the loud topic one might expect after such a strange discovery. Instead, the village behaved in a manner that Miss Marple found far more suspicious than open gossip. People spoke politely about ordinary matters, about gardens, the weather, and the price of bread at the small shop near the square. Yet every conversation seemed to stop the moment someone came too close to mentioning the church. It was as if the entire village had agreed, without saying so aloud, that certain things should remain unspoken. Miss Marple noticed this silence everywhere she went that afternoon. When she visited the grocer to buy tea, the shopkeeper greeted her with his usual kindness, but his voice grew noticeably careful when she asked about the events of the morning. When she passed two women speaking outside the bakery, their quiet conversation ended abruptly the moment they saw her approaching. Neither of them mentioned Edward Blake, yet both looked relieved when Miss Marple simply wished them a good day and continued walking. Miss Marple had seen this behavior before in other places and other circumstances. Silence often grows strongest when people are afraid of what the truth might reveal. A village like St. Mary Mead valued its peaceful reputation, and anything that threatened that peace could easily become something people preferred not to discuss. By late afternoon Miss Marple had reached the churchyard. The old stone church stood in its usual place among the tall trees, calm and unchanged, as if nothing unusual had happened within its walls that morning. A faint wind moved the leaves above the gravestones, and the quiet sound of rustling branches gave the place a solemn stillness. Miss Marple paused at the gate and looked toward the church door. It was closed now, and a simple notice had been placed beside the handle stating that the building would remain locked until further examination by the authorities. That alone was enough to make several villagers uncomfortable. The church had always been open to anyone seeking prayer or reflection, and its sudden closure felt like a small but important break in the normal life of the village. As Miss Marple stood there observing the quiet churchyard, she noticed someone approaching along the path. It was the vicar, Reverend Leonard Carter, a tall man whose gentle nature had made him well liked by nearly everyone in St. Mary Mead. Yet today he looked troubled in a way that was unusual even for such a thoughtful person. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," he said with a tired smile. "Good afternoon, Reverend Carter," she replied kindly. "I imagine it has been a difficult day for you." The vicar nodded slowly. "Yes, I am afraid it has. Discovering such a tragedy within the church is something I never expected to experience." Miss Marple studied his expression carefully. "Have the authorities reached any conclusions?" "Not yet," the vicar answered. "Dr. Hayward examined Mr. Blake briefly this morning, but he insisted that a proper examination must take place before anything certain can be said. The police from the nearby town have also been informed." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And the villagers?" The vicar sighed quietly. "Most people are unsettled, but they prefer not to speak about it. Some seem almost frightened by the idea that something unpleasant could happen in such a peaceful place." Miss Marple allowed herself a small knowing smile. Villagers often believe they are immune to unpleasant truths. Unfortunately, they rarely are. The vicar looked toward the church door as if remembering the sight from earlier that morning. The caretaker was deeply shaken when he found Mr. Blake. "He told me that the man was lying near the front pew as though he had fallen suddenly. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing that suggested violence." Miss Marple considered this detail carefully. And Mr. Blake's expression. The vicar hesitated. The caretaker mentioned that his face looked frightened, as though he had seen something just before he collapsed. Miss Marple's mind began quietly assembling possibilities. Fear at the moment of death could mean many things. It might suggest illness, sudden shock, or even the presence of another person. Was Mr. Blake known to visit the church often? She asked. Only occasionally, the vicar replied. He attended services perhaps twice since arriving in the village. Otherwise he rarely came here. Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at the tall windows of the church. Then it is curious that he chose to spend time inside the church late in the evening. Yes, the vicar admitted quietly. That question has troubled me as well. Miss Marple walked slowly along the churchyard path while the vicar accompanied her. After a moment she spoke again, her tone gentle but precise. Tell me, Reverend Carter, did Mr. Blake ever mention why he came to St. Mary Mead? The vicar shook his head. No, he kept his personal affairs private. I once asked whether he had family nearby, but he simply said he preferred quiet places. Miss Marple stopped beside one of the old gravestones and looked back toward the church door. People who seek quiet places often do so for a reason. Sometimes they are searching for peace, but sometimes they are hiding from something. The vicar gave a thoughtful nod, though the idea clearly troubled him. At that moment another figure appeared at the far end of the churchyard path. It was Mr. Harold Finch, the village solicitor, a precise and serious man who rarely showed emotion. Today he walked toward them with an unusual urgency. Ah, Miss Marple, Reverend Carter, he said when he reached them. I was hoping to speak with you. Miss Marple greeted him politely. Good afternoon, Mr. Finch. I assume this concerns Mr. Blake. Mr. Finch adjusted his glasses before answering. Yes, indeed it does. I have just learned something that may explain why Mr. Blake came to St. Mary Mead in the first place. Both Miss Marple and the vicar listened closely. Mr. Blake visited my office 2 weeks ago, Mr. Finch continued. He brought with him several documents and asked for legal advice regarding a certain financial matter. Miss Marple's curiosity sharpened immediately. What kind of financial matter? Mr. Finch hesitated before answering, as if weighing whether the information should be shared. He believed that someone had been attempting to locate him, Mr. Finch said carefully. Apparently he had once been involved in a business partnership that ended badly. A significant amount of money disappeared during that time, and several individuals suspected Mr. Blake of taking it. The vicar looked surprised. Are you suggesting he was hiding from those people? Mr. Finch nodded slowly. That was certainly the impression I received. Mr. Blake insisted he was innocent, but he feared that someone might attempt to confront him. Miss Marple remained silent for a moment, absorbing the significance of this information. A man suspected of stealing money chooses a quiet village to hide, she said thoughtfully. Then he is found dead inside a church, apparently frightened just before his death. The vicar looked uneasy. Do you believe someone followed him here? Miss Marple's gaze drifted once more toward the silent church building. It is certainly possible, she said quietly. But there is something even more curious. Both men looked at her expectantly. If someone truly wished to confront Mr. Blake, Miss Marple continued, why would that confrontation take place inside a locked church late at night? The question hung in the air unanswered. Mr. Finch looked troubled. You mean that whoever met him there might have been someone he trusted? Miss Marple gave a small thoughtful nod. That would seem the most reasonable explanation. The vicar looked toward the church door again, and for the first time the peaceful building appeared less comforting than it had before. Because if Miss Marple's reasoning was correct, Edward Blake had not entered the church alone that night. Someone from St. Mary Mead had been with him. And the silence spreading across the village suddenly felt far less innocent than it had that morning. Chapter 3: The Silence Breaks. The following morning, St. Mary Mead no longer felt peacefully quiet. The silence that had filled the village since Edward Blake's death had become tense and uneasy. People still spoke politely to one another in the lanes, but their voices were careful and restrained, as though everyone feared saying the wrong thing. Miss Marple understood this kind of silence very well. It was the sort that appeared when the truth was close, but no one wished to be the first to reveal it. Miss Marple sat in her garden with her knitting resting in her lap, thinking quietly about everything she had learned. Edward Blake had come to the village to hide from his past. He had received a letter demanding that he meet someone in the church late at night. The expression on his face when he died had shown fear, not illness. Most importantly, the person who had asked for that meeting had known exactly where Blake was living. Which meant that the visitor could only have been someone who already knew the village. Her thoughts were interrupted when Mr. Harold Finch arrived at her gate once again. He looked more serious than usual, and he carried a small folded paper in his hand. "Miss Marple," he said, sitting across from her, "I have learned something that may settle this entire matter." Miss Marple listened carefully. "Yesterday evening," Mr. Finch continued, "one of the villagers admitted that he wrote the letter asking Mr. Blake to come to the church. His name is Peter Lawson." Miss Marple nodded slowly. She already remembered Peter Lawson very well. He was a quiet carpenter who had lived in the village for many years. Mr. Lawson once worked in the same town as Mr. Blake, Mr. Finch explained. Years ago they were business partners in a building company. During that time a large sum of money disappeared, and Lawson was blamed for it. His reputation was ruined. Miss Marple's expression remained calm as the final pieces of the mystery settled into place. "Then Mr. Lawson discovered that Mr. Blake had come here," she said gently. "Yes," Mr. Finch replied. "He confronted Blake inside the church and demanded the truth." "What happened next?" Miss Marple asked. Mr. Finch sighed quietly before answering. Blake realized Lawson had proof that the money had been stolen. When he understood that the truth would soon be known, he panicked. According to the doctor, the shock was enough to stop his heart. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "So there was no violence?" "None at all," Mr. Finch said. "Only the end of a very long deception." By the afternoon the truth spread calmly through St. Mary Mead. The strange silence that had troubled the village slowly disappeared as people finally understood what had happened. Edward Blake had carried his secret for years, but the moment he was forced to face it, his fear had ended everything. That evening Miss Marple looked out across the quiet road from her window as the church bell rang once more. The village had returned to its peaceful rhythm, but she knew that even the quietest places could hide complicated stories beneath the surface. Because sometimes the most powerful force in a mystery is not noise or violence. Sometimes it is simply silence. And silence, when it finally breaks, can reveal everything. If you enjoyed this mystery from St. Mary Mead, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the story with other mystery lovers. More quiet mysteries and clever investigations are waiting just ahead.